The morning Celia Conley rode into Harlan Creek, Texas, with nothing but a worn leather saddlebag, a steady pair of hands, and a reputation that preceded her like thunder before a storm. Every man on the main street stopped what he was doing and stared. It was the spring of 1878, and the town of Harlan Creek sat in the broad, sun-baked heart of West Texas like a stubborn weed refusing to be pulled from cracked earth. The buildings along the main thoroughfare were bleached pale by years of relentless sun, and the smell of cattle and horse and wood smoke hung over everything like a permanent fixture of the air itself. It was a hard place, built by hard people, and it did not much care for surprises. Celia Conley was precisely that. She was 26 years old, tall for a woman, with dark auburn hair she kept pinned under a wide-brimmed hat that had seen better days. Her eyes were a shade of brown so deep they looked nearly black in certain lights, and they had a way of taking in a room, or a street, or a field with a calm, measuring quality that unsettled people who were not accustomed to being assessed rather than deferred to. She wore trousers, which caused more than one woman on the boardwalk to press her lips together in disapproval, and a plain cotton shirt rolled at the sleeves. Her boots were good quality, the one luxury she had never been willing to sacrifice, even in her leanest years. She had grown up on a cattle operation outside of San Antonio, the only child of a widowed father who had taught her everything he knew before his heart gave out when she was 19. She had run the small spread herself for 2 years after that, until the bank had come calling with a debt her father had hidden from her, and a deed she could not fight. She had lost the land, but she had kept the knowledge. She had kept every single thing her father had poured into her, and she had been hiring that knowledge out to ranches across the state ever since, working as a hand, as a drover, twice as an assistant foreman under men who knew less than she did but were paid 3 times as much. She had come to Harlan Creek because of a notice pinned to the board outside the general store in the last town she had passed through. She had read it twice, and then she had pulled it off the board and folded it into her shirt pocket. Foreman WANTED. Covington Ranch, Harlan Creek. Serious applicants only. Room and board provided. Fair wages. Inquire with Gilbert Covington. What the notice had not said, and what Celia would learn only upon arriving, was that the position had been open for 6 weeks. That 4 men had taken the job and quit within their first few days. That the cowhands on the Covington Ranch were, by nearly universal agreement among every working man in a 50-mile radius, the most ornery, difficult, unmanageable collection of individuals ever assembled under one employer. And that Gilbert Covington himself, while not a bad man, was so thoroughly absorbed in the grief of losing his wife the previous year and the financial trouble that had crept in during his distraction, that he had let things on his ranch slide into a state of such spectacular disorganization that even the most experienced foreman in the county had taken one look and ridden away shaking their heads. None of that would have stopped Celia Conley. If anything, it would have made her more interested. She found the Covington Ranch by asking at the livery stable, a modest establishment run by an old man named Harv who gave her directions with the specific, unsubtle warning that she was wasting her time. She thanked him politely, asked him to see to her horse, a bay mare named Duchess, and walked the quarter-mile to the ranch house on foot. The place was in an interesting state. The main house was solid, 2 stories, well built from good timber, but the yard around it was cluttered with equipment left out in the weather. She could see a broken fence line to the east that had not been repaired, and from the direction of the bunkhouse she could hear 2 men arguing loudly about something that seemed to involve a card game. The water trough near the barn was low. Someone had left a saddle on the top rail of the corral and it had been rained on. She catalogued all of this as she crossed the yard, and by the time she knocked on the front door of the ranch house, she already had a working picture of what needed doing. The man who opened the door was not what she had expected, though she could not have said precisely what she had expected. Gilbert Covington was 31 years old, broad-shouldered and lean in the way of men who worked hard and forgot to eat regularly. He had dark hair that curled at his temples when it got too long, which it was now, and gray eyes that were, in that particular moment, shadowed with the specific exhaustion of a man who had been carrying too much for too long. He was handsome in the way of men who did not think about it, all strong jaw and quiet, unposed bearing. But what struck Celia first was not his appearance. It was the paper he was holding in one hand, and the way he was frowning at it as if it had personally offended him. He looked up from the paper when he heard the knock, and whatever he had been expecting, it was evident that it was not her. "I am here about the foreman position," Celia said before he could speak. "My name is Celia Conley. I have 7 years of ranch experience, 3 of those running an operation solo, and I have worked cattle drives, branding, fence management, supply organization, and hand supervision. I am available immediately." Gilbert Covington looked at her for a long moment. The paper in his hand lowered slowly. His gray eyes moved from her face to the yard behind her, as though checking whether someone else, someone more expected, might be following her. "You are applying for the foreman job," he said. "I am not applying. I am telling you I can do it. Whether you hire me depends on whether you are more concerned with getting your ranch running properly or with what the men at the feed store will say about it." Another long pause. In the bunkhouse, the argument had risen in volume. Something fell over with a crash and was followed by laughter. Gilbert Covington turned and looked in the direction of the bunkhouse for a moment, and then he looked back at Celia. "Come in," he said. The inside of the house was better kept than the outside suggested it would be. There were books on a shelf, which she noticed because it was unusual. The furniture was plain and practical, but the floors were swept, and there were curtains at the windows that looked like they had been recently washed. She wondered who was keeping the house, and supposed it was probably a woman from town. He offered her a chair at the kitchen table and poured 2 cups of coffee without asking whether she wanted any, which she appreciated. He set one in front of her and sat across the table, and she could see him doing the same kind of assessment she had been doing, taking stock, measuring, trying to determine what he was actually looking at. "The last foreman quit on Thursday," he said. "Before that, there were 3 others. None of them lasted more than 10 days. "I heard something like that," she said. "My hands are not easy men," he said. "They are experienced, most of them, but they are used to doing things a certain way, and that way has become somewhat—" He paused, looking for the word. "Chaotic," she offered. A muscle moved at the corner of his mouth. "I was going to say relaxed, but chaotic is probably more accurate. There is a broken fence on your east line. Probably has been broken for 2 weeks, at least based on the condition of the post. That means cattle getting out, and if they are getting out on the east side, they are likely mixing with the Hadley spread if the Hadleys run the land that direction." His jaw tightened slightly. "They do, and yes, that has been a source of conversation. There is a saddle left on the corral rail. Your water trough near the barn is half empty. The equipment I can see from your front yard suggests no one has assigned storage places for anything in quite a while. And unless I am wrong about what I was hearing from your bunkhouse, you have at least 2 men who are gambling when they should be working." Gilbert set his coffee cup down. He looked at her with an expression that was not quite surprise and not quite relief, but somewhere between the two. "How long did you say you have been in ranching?" "My whole life," she said simply. "My father owned a spread outside of San Antonio. He raised me to run it. I have been doing ranch work since I was old enough to hold a rope." "Your father, does he still run the operation?" "He passed away. The bank took the land after. There was a debt I did not know about." He received this information quietly in a way that did not make it awkward. "I am sorry about that." "So am I," she said, and it was the most honest thing she had said in the conversation, simple and unguarded. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Outside, the sun was moving toward midday and the shadows in the yard were shortening. "I will tell you the truth, Miss Conley," Gilbert said. "I cannot afford to have another foreman quit on me. I am behind on 2 accounts that need settling before summer, and I have a cattle drive to organize for August that requires a working operation between now and then. I need someone who can actually get control of this place and hold it." He paused. "The men are going to give you trouble." "Yes," she agreed, "they will. That does not concern you. I have dealt with difficult men my whole career, Mr. Covington. The trick is not to fight them. The trick is to outwork them until they run out of reasons to doubt you." He studied her for another moment, and then he nodded once, decisively, the way a man does when he has made up his mind and does not intend to second-guess it. "The wages are $30 a month plus room and board. There is a small room at the end of the bunkhouse that had a wall put up for privacy when we had a married hand staying on. You are welcome to it." "That is acceptable," she said. "When can you start?" Celia Conley picked up her coffee cup, took a slow sip, and set it down. "I already have," she said. The rest of that first afternoon was a master class in what a person could accomplish when they simply refused to be intimidated. Celia started by walking the entire property. She did this alone, with a small notebook she pulled from her saddlebag, making notes in a compact, practical hand. She walked the fence lines, checked the water sources, walked through the barn and assessed the feed stores, the condition of the tack, the state of the equipment. She went into the pastures and looked at the cattle, counting and noting the condition of the herd. Then she walked back to the bunkhouse and knocked on the door. There were 6 ranch hands in total on the Covington payroll. Their names were Decker, Amos, Ruiz, Pete, Sully, and a quiet young man barely past 20 named Eli, whose last name she never heard because the others never used it. They ranged in age from Eli's approximate 20 to Decker's 50-something, and they ranged in disposition from Amos's guarded wariness to Decker's open, arms folded across chest hostility. "You cannot be the new foreman," Decker said. He was a big man, weathered as old leather, with a silver-streaked beard and the particular permanent squint of someone who had spent decades working under a bright sun. "No offense intended." "None taken," Celia said pleasantly, "and I am the new foreman. I need all 6 of you ready to work in 30 minutes. We have a fence to fix on the east line, a trough to fill, and I need to know how you have been rotating the south pasture because from what I can see, it is overgrazed on the near side, and the cattle are being pushed up to the far corner rather than spread properly." The silence in the bunkhouse had the particular quality of a room full of men who had just had the rug pulled out from under an argument they had been planning to have. "Now, Decker," she said, because it was important to address the skeptic directly, "I know you have questions about whether I know what I am doing. That is a fair thing to wonder about anyone new. But I am asking you to hold those questions for about 48 hours, because in 48 hours you will have a better answer than anything I could tell you right now. Can you do that?" Decker looked at her for a long moment. His arms did not unfold, but something shifted in his expression, not acceptance, not even close, but a kind of grudging recognition that she had addressed him specifically and directly and honestly, which was apparently more than the previous foreman had managed. 48 hours, he said, as though it were a negotiation. 48 hours, she confirmed. They fixed the fence that afternoon. It took the better part of 3 hours, and Celia worked alongside them, not directing from a comfortable distance but in the dirt with a post driver and wire cutters, and she worked faster than Sully, who had apparently always prided himself on his fence work, which caused a noticeable reassessment in his expression around the 90-minute mark. By the time the sun started going down, the east fence was solid, the water trough was full, the equipment in the yard had been sorted into organized storage, and Celia had given each man a specific task list for the following day that accounted for their individual skill sets, because she had spent part of the afternoon asking them direct questions about what they were good at, which no one had apparently done in a while. She ate supper alone in the small room at the end of the bunkhouse, which was bare but adequate, and she was asleep before 9 o'clock with the notebook open on her knee. The next morning she was up before the sun. The second day was harder in some ways and easier in others. Decker tested her twice, once by simply not doing what she had asked and waiting to see what she would do about it, and once by questioning her loudly in front of the other men about her decision to shift the cattle rotation pattern on the south pasture. For the first test, she simply told him, without heat or drama, that the task she had assigned him needed to be completed before noon, and that if it was not, she would need to tell Mr. Covington that they had a problem, because she was not going to do the task herself when she had assigned it to a capable man. She said it quietly, out of earshot of the others, and she said it looking him directly in the eye. He did the task. For the second test, she answered his question about the pasture rotation in full, technical detail, explaining the grazing pressure she had observed, and the soil condition in the near section, and the way the cattle were crowding and competing for forage in the corner, and what that would mean for the condition of the herd going into summer if it continued. She spoke with the easy confidence of someone who genuinely knew the answer, not the defensive certainty of someone trying to prove a point. Decker listened to the whole thing. Then he said, "My old boss in Colorado did it that way too. It works." And he walked away, and that was the last significant challenge to her authority from Decker, though it took another few days before he would say anything resembling a compliment. On the third day, Gilbert Covington came out to the south pasture where Celia was overseeing the repositioning of a temporary fence section, and he stopped his horse on the rise above the field and just looked at the work being done below. She was directing Ruiz and Pete with a quiet efficiency, moving between them, demonstrating something with a fence post, and both men were following her direction without visible resentment. The broken equipment from the yard had disappeared into the barn. The herd was spread properly across the south pasture for the first time in weeks. He could see, from where he sat, that the east fence was neatly repaired. He stayed there for a few minutes without saying anything. Then he rode back to the house. That evening, he found her at the barn doing a check on one of the horses that had seemed slightly off during the afternoon ride. She had the horse's front right leg lifted and was examining the hoof with the concentrated attention of someone who expected to find the answer to a problem they had already diagnosed. "Stone bruise," she said without looking up. "Nothing serious, but he should not be ridden hard for the next few days. I will let Sully know since he normally takes this one." "How did you know it was Sully's horse?" Gilbert asked. "He keeps his halter on the third peg and his saddle on the second stand, and this horse favored standing near the third peg when he had a choice." She set the hoof down gently and straightened, rubbing the horse's neck. "Little things." Gilbert leaned against the barn door frame with his arms folded, not aggressively but comfortably, and she noticed that he looked slightly less exhausted than he had the day she arrived. Not rested, there was still that weight around his eyes, but perhaps fractionally lighter. "I wanted to thank you," he said. "You hired me to do a job," she said. "I am doing it." "The last 4 foremen could not manage what you have done in 3 days," he said. "I think that merits acknowledgement." She turned to look at him directly. In the lamplit barn, with the warm smell of hay and horse around them and the evening sounds of the ranch settling in for the night, she took in the honesty in his expression and felt something shift slightly in her chest that she chose to ignore for the moment. "They probably could have managed it," she said. "They just quit before they got the chance." "Why did they quit?" "Because the men pushed back and they took it personally." "You cannot take it personally. These are not bad men, your hands. They are experienced men who have been left without proper direction for too long and have gotten comfortable. That is not malice. It just needs redirecting." "You have a very practical way of seeing people," he said. "My father was a practical man. He taught me that most problems that look like people problems are actually structure problems. Give people a clear structure, and most of them will work within it. It is the absence of structure that makes things go sideways." Gilbert was quiet for a moment, and she could see him turning that idea over thoughtfully. "My wife was the one who kept the structure," he said. The words came out simply, but they carried weight, and she understood that he had not been talking about the ranch. "After she passed, he stopped, pressed his lips together briefly. Things fell apart in ways I did not fully notice until they were quite far gone. "I am sorry about your wife," Celia said. "Her name was Margaret," he said. "She died of a fever last April. It was very sudden. That must have been very hard." "It still is," he said, with a directness that she respected because it would have been easier to say something more distant. She nodded, not filling the silence with anything unnecessary. After a moment he said, "I will let you get on with it," and straightened from the door frame, and as he turned to go he paused and said, "The coffee in the morning is usually made by whoever wakes up first. For the last 6 months that has been me. I expect I will be up before you," she said. He made a small sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh and walked back toward the house, and Celia turned back to the horse in the stall and spent a moment with her hand on his warm neck before she finished her work and went to bed. She was right about the coffee. She was at the house kitchen well before first light, and it was not until she had the coffee made and was standing at the kitchen window, watching the sky begin to pale, that she heard his boots on the stairs. He came into the kitchen already dressed, saw the coffee, and stopped. "You were not joking," he said. "I rarely joke before sunrise," she said, pouring a cup and setting it on the table. He sat down and wrapped both hands around the cup, and she turned back to the window, and they existed in a comfortable quiet for several minutes while the sky went from black to deep blue to the first pale thread of gold. "I need to talk to you about the August drive," he said eventually. "I know," she said. "I found the accounts ledger in the office when I was looking for the property survey. I hope you do not mind. I needed the survey to understand the fence layout. I do not mind." "What did you see?" She turned from the window, leaned against the counter with her own cup. "You need a successful drive to clear the 2 outstanding debts. The herd is in reasonable shape. The condition will improve considerably over the next 2 months if we manage the pastures correctly. The main thing you need between now and August is a full, disciplined crew that can execute a drive efficiently." "That is precisely the situation," he said. "Do you think the men can get there?" "Yes," she said, without hesitation. "They are good workers. Sully is excellent with horses. Ruiz knows cattle as well as anyone I have worked with. Decker is," she considered her words, "he is ornery, but he is capable. And once he respects your authority, he is as solid as the fence posts he sets. The ones I am less sure of are Pete and Eli. Pete has been here 2 years. He means well, but he is careless. I have noticed. I'm going to give him tasks that require care and watch closely. Either he learns to be precise or we will know before August that he is not the right man for the drive." She paused. "Eli concerns me for a different reason. He works hard and he is not careless. But he is very young and something about this situation is making him anxious. I do not know yet what it is." Gilbert looked at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize, the slightly arrested attention he gave her when she said something he had not expected. "I did not realize that about Eli," he said. "Has anything happened with him recently that you know of?" Gilbert thought about it. "His mother is ill, I believe. He mentioned it some weeks ago, and I am ashamed to say I did not follow up." "I will talk to him," Celia said. And she did, that same afternoon, when she found Eli working alone at the back of the barn repairing harnesses. She did not approach it directly. She sat down on a hay bale near him and started on a second harness without being invited, and they worked in companionable silence for a while before she said, "Your mother is ill, Mr. Covington tells me." Eli's hands went still for a moment. "Yes, ma'am." "Is she somewhere she is being looked after?" "My aunt is with her." "In Abilene," he paused. "I send most of my wages home every month." "That is a good son," she said. His hands started moving again slowly. "I have been worried about leaving on the August drive. It is 6 weeks gone. If something happened, the drive is a few months out still," Celia said. "A lot can change, and if your mother's situation changes before then, that is a conversation to have with Mr. Covington directly. He is a fair man." Eli looked at her. "You think so?" "I do," she said, and she found that she meant it. Within the first week on the Covington Ranch, Celia had restructured the daily rotation of tasks, repaired the east fence line, organized the equipment storage, addressed the south pasture grazing issue, diagnosed the stone bruise in Sully's horse and treated it correctly, drafted a preliminary plan for the August cattle drive, and perhaps most significantly, turned a bunkhouse full of skeptical, reluctant men into something that looked, from a certain angle, like a functioning team. She did not celebrate this. She was not built for self-congratulation. But on the evening of the seventh day, when she was sitting on the step outside the bunkhouse with her notebook in the last of the evening light, and Gilbert Covington came across the yard to where she was sitting and stopped and looked at her with something in his expression that was new and unguarded and genuinely warm, she allowed herself one small moment of satisfaction. "You told me to give you 48 hours when you arrived," he said. "That was 7 days ago. I want you to know that this ranch looks and runs differently than it has since." He stopped himself again at that familiar wall. "Since before Margaret passed, I want you to know that I see it." "The men did the work," she said, "with direction they had not been given in a long time," he said. He sat down on the step beside her, leaving a proper distance, and looked out across the yard where the lanterns were beginning to glow in the blue dusk. "I have been absent in a way, not physically, but in the ways that matter for running a place like this. I let things go because I did not have the energy for it. Grief does that," she said quietly. "It does not announce itself. It just takes things, quietly. You do not realize what it has taken until later." He looked at her with an attention that was different from his usual careful assessment. "You have known grief like that." "I have. My father, when I lost him, it was not just him I lost. It was the land, and the future I had understood for myself, and the person he saw when he looked at me. All of that went at once." She looked at her notebook rather than at him. "It took me a long time to understand that losing all of that did not mean there was nothing left." The quiet between them had a different quality now, warmer and more personal, and Celia was aware of it in a way that she decided was worth paying attention to and also worth being careful about. She had a job to do, and she intended to do it well, and getting complicated feelings about her employer was not, strictly speaking, part of the plan. But she noticed the way his shoulder was close to hers on the step. She noticed the way the lamplight from the bunkhouse window fell across the line of his jaw, and she noticed that she was noticing these things, and that notice was a piece of information. She closed her notebook. "I should get some sleep," she said. "Early start tomorrow. I want to get the crew started on clearing the irrigation channel behind the north pasture while the ground is still soft." "Of course," he said. He did not move immediately, and in that brief pause something passed between them that was not words, and was not quite yet anything definite, but was there nonetheless. Then he stood, and she said good night and went inside, and he walked back across the yard to the house, and both of them were very professionally and practically not thinking about the warmth of the other's presence on that step. The weeks that followed were some of the most absorbing of Celia's adult life. The work was hard and constant and deeply satisfying in the way that only work you are genuinely suited for can be. She drove the crew consistently but not brutally, setting standards and holding to them without cruelty. And she had a gift for explaining the reason behind what she asked for in a way that made the men feel like participants in a shared enterprise, rather than instruments of someone else's agenda. Decker came around completely by the end of the second week, and his coming around had a seismic effect on the others, because Decker was the elder statesman of the bunkhouse, and what he respected, the others respected. He did not make a speech about it or even say anything direct. He simply started coming to Celia first when a question came up, rather than going around her, and one morning she arrived at the barn to find he had already done a task she had been planning to assign, done it correctly and completely, without being asked. She thanked him and he grunted, and that was the entirety of the ceremony, but it was an important moment. Pete was harder. He was careless in the way of someone who had never been asked to be otherwise, not lazy but inattentive, his mind always slightly ahead of his hands, and more than once his inattention created small but real problems. A gate left improperly latched, a supply count done wrong, an instruction half followed. Celia addressed each one individually without anger, but with a consistency that made clear she remembered every instance and expected improvement. By the end of the month, Pete was measurably more careful, though it remained something he had to work at. Eli, after the conversation in the barn, seemed lighter. He worked with a steadier attention, and when a letter came from Abilene midway through the month saying his mother had improved, he told Celia before anyone else, and she accepted the news with a genuine warmth that seemed to mean something to him. Celia's days were full and structured, and she was exactly where she wanted to be in terms of professional purpose. But the evenings, those were the complicated part. It became a habit, almost without either of them deciding it was a habit, that Gilbert would find a reason to be in the yard or near the barn in the hour before dark when Celia was finishing her last round of the property. They would exchange information about the day, a practical, efficient exchange of necessary details. And then the exchange would slow and become conversation, and the conversation would stretch into the blue evening air and go places that were nothing to do with fence lines or cattle rotation. He told her about growing up in Georgia before his family came west after the war, about learning to ranch from scratch because the only land his father could afford was Texas land, and there was no one to teach them the work except neighbors and hard experience. She told him about her father, about the specific way he had taught her, not by lecturing, but by working alongside her and letting her figure things out, only stepping in when she was about to make a mistake that couldn't be undone. "He sounds like he was a remarkable man," Gilbert said one evening. "He was ordinary in most ways," she said, and there was love in the word ordinary that made the air between them feel tender. "He was kind and patient, and he believed completely that I could do anything I set my mind to. That is not a small thing." "No," Gilbert agreed. "It is not." She had begun to see him more clearly as the weeks passed, not just as her employer but as a person, and what she saw was a man who had once known exactly who he was and what he was building, and had lost the thread of that in grief, and was slowly, haltingly, finding his way back to it. There was a particular quality to the way he talked about the ranch when he talked about the future of it, an old light coming back on behind his eyes, and she recognized that light because she had felt something like it herself in recent weeks, the satisfaction of a purpose reclaimed. One evening in late May, a rider came up the drive fast, which was never a good sign, and pulled up short in the yard with the particular urgent posture of someone bringing bad news. It was a hand from the neighboring Hadley spread, a young man Celia had seen in town once. "Mr. Covington," the young man said, hat already off. "Mr. Hadley sent me. He says there are strangers on the east line right where your property meets his. 3 men. They have been there 2 days running, he says. He does not know their business, but he does not like the look of them." Gilbert's expression hardened. "Thank you. Tell Hadley I appreciate the notice." After the rider left, Celia said, "That is worth a look before sundown." "I agree. I will go in the morning." "I will come with you," she said. He looked at her with that brief arrested expression. "You do not need to. You are my employer. Your property is my responsibility. I will come with you." He accepted this without further argument. They rode out the next morning at first light, just the two of them, and it was the first time Celia had been alone with Gilbert Covington for any extended stretch, not counting the morning coffee in the kitchen or the yard conversations, but alone in the way you are alone when you are riding side by side through open country with no one else in earshot, and the world is wide, and the sky is immense above you, and there is something loosening about the sheer openness of it. They talked easily as they rode. He asked her about the drive plan, and she walked him through it in detail, and he asked thoughtful questions that showed he understood the operation better than his recent distractedness might have suggested. The morning was cool and clear, and the spring grass was an improbable bright green against the pale blue sky, and Celia had the specific feeling of physical rightness that came from being on horseback in open country, which had been her most reliable comfort since childhood. "You love it," he said, watching her. "Love what? The country. You can see it in you when you ride." She considered this. "Yes," she said, "I do, the scale of it. My father used to say that being on horseback in open country was the closest a person could come to understanding how small they were without it being frightening, because the smallness felt like freedom rather than helplessness." "That is true," he said softly. "That is exactly true." They were quiet for a moment, riding through the morning, and the quiet felt like something they were sharing rather than simply existing in. The east fence line was clear when they reached it. No strangers. Just the repaired fence post Celia's crew had put in, and the broad, grass-covered land rolling away on both sides. They rode the full length of the boundary without finding anything concerning, and they concluded that whatever the strangers had been about, probably just passing through, cattle buyers perhaps, or land speculators who had become increasingly common in the county, they had moved on. On the ride back, Gilbert said, "Can I ask you something personal?" She glanced at him. "You can ask. Why do you not have your own operation? Given everything you know, everything you are capable of, it seems obvious that you should be running your own place." She was quiet for a moment, feeling the answer out. "The land I loved was taken by debt," she said. "After that, it was not simple to get capital for a new start. And the work, the day-to-day running of it, I have always been able to find that. What I have not been able to find is the permanence." She paused. "The feeling of belonging to a place and the place belonging to me." "That sounds lonely," he said very quietly. "It has been," she admitted. It was perhaps the most unguarded thing she had said since arriving, and she felt the vulnerability of it and did not retreat from it. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, open in a way that his face was not always open, and she held his gaze for one long, honest moment before looking back at the trail ahead. They did not say anything more significant on the rest of the ride back, but something between them had shifted very slightly on its axis, and both of them felt it, and neither of them said so. June arrived, and with it, the serious work of preparing for the August drive. Celia threw herself into it with the full force of her attention, because it was genuinely important, and also because having a great deal to do was helpful when your feelings about your employer had taken on a dimension that exceeded professional interest. She reorganized the supply chain for the drive, contacted drovers in 2 neighboring counties to arrange temporary help for the trail, and worked with Ruiz to develop the route, a northeastern track to a buyer in Abilene who had a standing agreement with Covington for the year's herd. She drew maps. She made lists. She held planning meetings in the bunkhouse on Sunday evenings where the whole crew sat around the table and went over the plan and raised problems and solved them together. Gilbert attended the last of these meetings, sitting at the back with his coffee cup, listening. After the men filed out, he stayed. "Where did you learn to run a meeting like that?" he asked. "I did not learn it anywhere. It just seems like the sensible approach. Most foremen I have known made the plans themselves and handed them down. The men follow because they have to. The men follow better when they feel they were part of making the plan," she said, gathering her papers. "They know things I do not know. Ruiz has driven this particular trail twice, and he had a suggestion about the water stop at the 2nd-day mark that I would not have thought of." "Ruiz has driven it twice," Gilbert said slowly. "I did not know that." "I asked," she said simply. He stood up from his chair, and for a moment they were both standing in the small bunkhouse in the lamplit evening, and he was looking at her with that open-faced attention, and she felt the pull of it very clearly and very physically, which was not convenient. "I am going to be straightforward with you," he said suddenly, as though he had decided something. "There is something I need to say, and I am not skilled at saying things that are not practical." She set her papers down on the table and waited. He stopped, started again. "I have been paying attention to you. That is probably obvious. And I have been telling myself it is because you are exceptional at your work, which is true, but it is not the whole truth." A pause. "The whole truth is that you are the first person I have wanted to talk to at the end of a day since Margaret died. The first person whose presence makes the evenings feel like something other than something to be endured." He said it simply, without decoration, and the simplicity of it was more affecting than any eloquence would have been. Celia was very still. "Mr. Covington," she said, "Gilbert," he said, "if you would." "Gilbert," she said, and the name was different in her mouth than she had expected, easier and more natural. "I think you should know that this is not a simple situation for me." "I know that," he said. "You work for me. I understand if that makes this." "It is not only that," she said. "I have spent my whole adult life building a reputation as someone who does the work and does it well and does not complicate things. I have been very careful about that." "I can hear the but coming," he said, and there was the edge of that potential smile again, the one that appeared and disappeared before it fully formed. "But," she said, and she looked at him steadily, the way she had learned to look at things she was trying to understand accurately. "I would be dishonest if I pretended I did not feel what I feel when I am in the same room as you, and I was raised to be honest." The silence that followed was the best kind of silence, the kind that is full of something rather than empty of it. He took one step toward her and stopped, asking permission with the pause, and she did not move away, and he lifted one hand and touched her jaw very gently, the way a man touches something he is afraid of breaking, and she reached up and covered his hand with hers, and neither of them said anything for a long moment. "I do not know how to do this properly," he said quietly above her. "I am not sure I ever did. Margaret and I grew up together and it was different. Easy in a way that I think was luck as much as anything." "I do not think there is a proper way," Celia said. He looked at her for a long moment, searching her face for something, and whatever he found there must have been sufficient, because he leaned forward slowly and pressed his lips to her forehead, and it was so gentle and so unexpected and so profoundly tender that she felt the back of her throat tighten in a way she had not expected. "I am going to go," he said, "because I think if I stay longer I will say something that should be said more carefully and on a different evening." "All right," she said. "Celia," he said, and it was the first time he had used her first name, and the way he said it was quiet and careful, like something precious being handled. "Good night, Gilbert," she said. He went, and she stood in the empty bunkhouse meeting room for a minute after he was gone, her hand still touching the place on her jaw where his palm had been. She was not foolish enough to think this was simple. Nothing about it was simple. He was her employer, and she was a woman who had spent 7 years fighting to be taken seriously at her work, and the two things together had a complicated relationship with the feelings she was currently experiencing. She thought about her father, who had been the most practical man she knew, and asked herself what he would have said. He would have said, "Be honest about what you want. Be honest about what it costs. And then decide whether the cost is worth the wanting." She folded up her papers and went to bed, and she lay in the dark with the sounds of the ranch settling around her and thought about gray eyes and the way the morning light fell through the kitchen window, and decided, quietly, that the wanting was worth nearly any cost she could think of. July was the most demanding month of her professional life, and also, unexpectedly, the most personally significant. The ranch was functioning at a level it had probably not achieved in at least 2 years. The herd was in excellent condition, the crew was cohesive and disciplined, and the logistics of the August drive were so thoroughly planned that Celia could recite the water stops, the overnight camps, and the contingency routes from memory. She and Gilbert moved around each other with a care that was the opposite of distance. They were careful with each other in the way of people who know they are carrying something fragile and do not want to drop it. He brought her coffee in the yard sometimes, just appeared with 2 cups and sat on the fence rail beside her while she worked through the morning plan, and she told herself it was just habit, and she knew it was not just habit, and that knowing had become one of the quiet pleasures of her days. One evening in mid-July, a small crisis arrived in the form of Pete, who had, in a spectacular lapse of the improved attentiveness Celia had spent weeks developing in him, left a supply gate unlatched, and 37 head of cattle had wandered off the property onto the grazing land to the northwest, which belonged to a man named Carl Tanner, who was not known for his good humor about trespassing cattle. Celia heard about it at sundown and took Ruiz and Sully with her, immediately to round up the cattle and bring them back. The retrieval took most of the night. working in the dark by lantern light with Tanner's men watching from a distance, and Tanner himself arriving in the last hour of the operation to make clear how very unhappy he was about the whole situation. Celia handled Tanner with a directness and a firmness that Ruiz would describe to the rest of the bunkhouse in admiring detail the next morning. She acknowledged the fault plainly. The gate had been left open and she took responsibility as foreman, and she offered a practical remedy in the form of a day's labor on Tanner's behalf for the inconvenience, which was fair, and which Tanner, deprived of his righteous grievance, had no reasonable basis to refuse. By the time they got the cattle back and secured and the gate properly fixed and the whole situation resolved, it was nearly 3 in the morning. They rode back tired and dusty, and Celia was so thoroughly exhausted that she dismounted in the yard on automatic and was halfway to the bunkhouse when she realized that the light was on in the ranch house kitchen. Gilbert was at the table with coffee. He looked up when she came through the door. "I heard about the gate," he said. "Pete," she said, sitting down. "I will deal with him in the morning when I have slept." He slid a cup of coffee toward her without comment. She drank it and felt the warmth spread through her and looked at him across the table in the lamplight and felt with a sudden and uncomplicated clarity that she was very close to being in love with this man. It was the kind of realization that arrived not dramatically but quietly, like a tide that has been coming in for some time, and you only notice it when the water is already at your feet. She was almost in love with him, and the almost was only because she was a careful person who did not fully commit to things until she was sure, and she was nearly sure. He was looking at her with a soft, steady attention. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Tired," she said, "but all right. You got them all back, all 37. He was quiet a moment. Then, "Celia, when the drive is done, when August is behind us and the accounts are settled," he stopped, organizing something. "I would like to talk with you about the future of this ranch, about what it could be, about whether you might want to be part of it differently than you are now." She looked at him across the coffee cups and the lamplight. "How differently?" she said, though she thought she knew. "I am not very good at saying things like this," he said. "I told you that, but I have been feeling very certain about you, about wanting you here. Not just as my foreman, though you are the best foreman I could possibly imagine, but as—" He stopped again, and she could see him being very honest with himself in real time. "I am asking whether you would consider a future here that was not a professional arrangement." "Are you asking me to marry you?" she said. She asked it directly because she was a direct person and because it was simpler. "Not yet," he said with a steadiness that was endearing. "I am asking whether it is something you would want to think about, whether you would give me the chance to ask you properly, in a way that is not 3 in the morning in a work kitchen after a cattle crisis." She set her coffee cup down and looked at him for a long, clear moment. "Yes," she said, "I would give you that chance." The August drive left on the 4th day of the month, heading northeast for Abilene with 212 head of cattle in reasonable condition, and a crew of 6 plus 2 temporary drovers that Celia had hired from the neighboring county. She rode at the front and Decker rode drag, and between them the herd moved at a steady, controlled pace that suggested a level of organizational discipline that the temporary drovers, who had worked less well-organized drives, found impressive. The drive was 6 days out and 5 days back, and it was hard and physical and consuming in the way that cattle drives have always been, with the specific particular exhaustion of long days in the saddle and short nights under open sky, and a constant attention to the herd and the weather and the condition of the trail. There were storms on the 3rd day that scattered the rear section of the herd and required 2 frantic hours of gathering in the rain. Sully's replacement horse threw a shoe on the 4th day, and she had to reorganize positions. Eli, to his credit, was steadier and more capable on the drive than she had seen him in any other context, as though the open trail was the environment that suited him best. She thought about Gilbert on the nights when the herd was settled and the watch rotation was set, and there was nothing left to do but look at the enormous Texas sky above the camp. She thought about what he had said in the kitchen at 3 in the morning and the quiet certainty with which he had said it. She thought about a future rooted to a particular piece of land and a particular man, and felt the pull of it so strongly that it frightened her slightly, not because it was unwanted, but because wanting something that much required a kind of courage that was different from the practical courage of her daily work. The cattle sale in Abilene went well. The buyer was fair, and the herd's condition was good, and the price was what Gilbert needed to clear the 2 outstanding debts with something to spare. Celia supervised the sale with an efficiency that impressed even Decker, who stood beside her during the transaction with the air of a man who was not surprised, but was definitely satisfied. On the last evening in Abilene, the crew ate a proper supper at a restaurant, the first time most of them had sat at a restaurant table in months, and there was a good-natured, celebratory ease among them that Celia felt as one of the best things she had built in the past months, this functioning, working cohesion among 7 men who had been, when she arrived, a fractious collection of individuals barely on speaking terms with a shared purpose. Eli sat beside her at supper and told her quietly that he had been to see his mother that afternoon. She was living in Abilene now, closer to the aunt who was caring for her, and she had been well enough to sit up and have tea. She wanted to know about my work, Eli said. I told her about the drive. I told her about you. He smiled, which he did not often do. She said a woman Foreman sounded like the most sensible thing she had heard of. Your mother sounds like a wise woman, Celia said. She is, he said simply and with love. She really is. The crew returned to the Covington Ranch on a bright afternoon, dusty and tired and satisfied, and Gilbert was waiting in the yard when they rode in, which was not something she had expected and which moved her more than she had anticipated. He shook hands with each of the men as they dismounted, thanking them specifically and by name, which she noted because it mattered, and then he came to her. She was still on Duchess, looking down at him from the saddle, and the afternoon sun was behind her, and she was aware of how she must look trail-worn and sunburned and not particularly graceful, and found that she did not care at all. Well, he said. 212 head, sold at a fair price, enough to clear both accounts and leave you with working capital for the fall, she said. His eyes closed briefly, and she saw the relief move through him like a physical thing. All of it, all of it. He looked up at her then, shading his eyes against the sun, and his expression was not the careful, measured look he had worn when she arrived, but something entirely different, open and warm and grateful, and something more. Come down from there, he said. She swung down from the saddle, and Duchess shifted contentedly beside her, and she and Gilbert were standing in the bright afternoon yard with the crew dispersing behind them and the horses making sounds in the barn and the ranch around them looking, she thought, like a place that had gotten back something it had been missing. I have something I want to say, he said. You mentioned something about doing it properly, she said. I believe those were the conditions. They were, he agreed. He was not nervous, she noticed. He was the steadiest version of himself, which was the version she had come to know best in the quiet mornings and the evening conversations, and that steadiness was one of the things she was most certain about. You came here 6 weeks ago, he said, and you did not walk through that door as anything other than exactly who you are, and you did not apologize for it, and you did not make yourself smaller to make anyone more comfortable, and you simply got on with being extraordinarily capable at something you were born to do. He paused. And in the process, you gave this place back to me, in a way I had not thought possible. Not just the operation of it, but the sense of what it could be, the future of it. Celia held very still, the way she did when something important was happening that she did not want to interrupt. I am in love with you, he said, quietly and without any preamble, and I would very much like to ask you whether you would marry me. In the yard, somewhere behind them, a horse stamped and a door banged, and the ordinary sounds of the ranch continued around them, indifferent to the profound significance of the moment, which somehow made it more real rather than less. I would, she said. He looked at her with an expression that was entirely without the careful, reserved quality his face usually carried, just open and warm and real. He reached out and took her hand, and her hand in his felt like something correct, like a connection that made sense in the physical world. "I do not have a ring at present," he said. "I know where to get a good one in Harlan Creek," she said. "Henderson's, next to the general store." He laughed, and it was a full laugh, unreserved, the best laugh she had heard from him in 6 weeks, and she felt it land somewhere inside her and stay there. "We can go tomorrow," he said. "We can go tomorrow," she agreed. They were married in October, at the small white church in Harlan Creek, on a clear cold morning with the sky that particular hard blue that Texas achieves in fall. The ceremony was attended by the full crew of the Covington Ranch, which included Decker, who wore a clean shirt to an obviously unprecedented level of discomfort, and who shook Gilbert's hand afterward with a grip that conveyed approximately 6 weeks' worth of approval that he had been unable to articulate any other way. Eli brought his mother from Abilene, who was well enough to make the journey and who sat in the front pew with the aunt and wept in a pleased way through the entire ceremony. Sully played a harmonica afterward in the yard outside the church in what was apparently considered a gesture of high celebration. Ruiz brought tamales made by his wife, who had ridden in from her family's place 20 miles south, and there was a general informal gathering in the churchyard that went on longer than anyone had planned. Old Harv from the livery stable came, which surprised Celia, because she had not specifically invited him. He told her afterward, with a directness that she appreciated, that he had told her she was wasting her time when she came into town in April, and that he had been as wrong as a man could be, and he was glad to have been wrong. She wore a dress borrowed from the wife of the hardware store owner, deep blue wool, and she kept her good boots on under it, and she thought her father would have found this completely appropriate. Gilbert's vows were simple and specific, which was exactly right. He promised her honesty and steadiness and a partnership that was equal in every way that mattered. She promised him the same. The minister looked slightly uncertain about the egalitarian cast of the vows, but the occasion was too clearly happy for anyone to object to anything. They rode back to the ranch together in the late afternoon, and Celia looked at the house and the yard and the barn and the fence lines and the rolling pasture, and felt the particular shift of ownership that had nothing to do with legal documents and everything to do with belonging. This was her place now, not just her work but her home. "What are you thinking?" Gilbert asked, watching her. "I am thinking that I am exactly where I should be," she said. He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand, and she let him hold it until they reached the house. The winter months were a new kind of full. There was the work, which continued ranches do not pause for love or marriage, and there was the strangeness and richness of building a shared life with someone in the particular compressed intimacy of a ranch house in winter. They talked constantly. This was perhaps the discovery of those first months. Not that they were compatible, which they had known for weeks before the wedding, but that they were specifically and particularly well suited to each other in the way of people who think in compatible ways and disagree in productive rather than destructive ways, and who can be in the same room doing separate things with a quality of shared quiet that is genuinely pleasurable. They disagreed about things. Celia thought the breeding decisions for the spring needed to be made more conservatively given the condition of the market, and Gilbert wanted to be more aggressive with a newer bloodline he had heard about from a rancher in Waco. They had the argument over the kitchen table in December with maps and numbers spread between them, and it was a real argument, not a gentle one, and at the end of it they arrived at a compromise that was better than either of their original positions, which Celia told him, and he told her that was the most characteristic thing she could have possibly said, and she laughed and threw a dish towel at him and he caught it. It was good. It was deeply, practically, consistently good. By the time January arrived, Celia was certain she was expecting a child, and she told Gilbert on a Tuesday morning over coffee with the same directness she brought to everything else. He set his cup down and looked at her for a long moment, and then a smile appeared that was unlike any expression she had seen on him before, wide and slightly undone and completely unguarded. "Are you certain?" he said, reasonably. "I will know more certainly in another few weeks." He reached across the table and took both of her hands in his. "How do you feel?" "Well, good actually. A little tired in the afternoons." "You should rest in the afternoons." "I will rest in the afternoons when there is nothing that needs doing in the afternoons," she said, which he knew from experience was not a capitulation, but which he accepted because he also knew from experience that Celia had a very good sense of her own limits. The child was confirmed in February by the doctor in Harlan Creek, a plain-spoken woman named Dr. Aldrich, who had come out to Harlan Creek 2 years prior with her husband, and who was the only female doctor in the county, and who Celia liked immediately for reasons that were entirely self-explanatory. The due date was estimated for late summer, which meant Celia would be managing the ranch in the heat of July and August while increasingly large with child, which she took in stride with the same equanimity she brought to other complicated logistical situations. The crew, when they were told, reacted in ways that were entirely characteristic. Decker said, "Right," and went back to work, and then appeared an hour later with a small carved wooden horse that he had apparently been making in his off hours for reasons that were not previously clear, and presented it to Celia without comment and went away again. Eli congratulated them both and smiled his rare, genuine smile. Sully said something congratulatory in a rush and turned red and disappeared. Ruiz said something in Spanish that Gilbert translated as a blessing, and which made Celia's eyes fill briefly against her will. Pete spilled an entire bucket of grain in his excitement and startled 3 horses, which was entirely characteristic, and which somehow in this context was entirely endearing. Spring came in with the particular exuberance of West Texas springs, and the ranch was in the best operational shape it had been in years. Celia had spent the winter months developing a system for the spring calving season that distributed the overnight watch rotation more efficiently than the previous arrangement, and the calving went smoothly, not without incident, because calving never goes without incident, but without the losses that had characterized the previous springs under less rigorous management. She continued in her role as foreman through her pregnancy without significant alteration, adapting certain physical tasks as her condition required, but maintaining the full scope of her managerial responsibilities. There were, predictably, opinions in Harlan Creek about this, and there were opinions among some of the neighboring ranchers about the propriety of it, and Celia's response to these opinions was to do her work so demonstrably well that the opinions became quietly irrelevant. Gilbert's response to those opinions was more direct when they reached him. He was not a combative man, but he was a steady and clear one, and when Tom Hadley, at the feed store in June, offered the unsolicited opinion that perhaps Mrs. Covington ought to be resting more and doing less, Gilbert looked at him with a calm gray gaze and said that his wife was an exceptionally capable person who was entirely competent to determine what was appropriate for her own situation, and that her management of the ranch had taken it from near failure to genuine prosperity, and that he was personally not interested in any opinion to the contrary. He said this without heat and with complete finality, and Tom Hadley changed the subject. Celia heard about this secondhand from Sully, who had been at the feed store, and she went to Gilbert that evening and said, "Thank you." "For what?" he said. "For saying what you said." He looked at her with that steady warmth. "I meant every word of it." "I know you did," she said. "That is why I am thanking you." He put his arm around her and she leaned against his shoulder, and they looked out at the evening ranch in the summer light, and she felt the particular fullness of a life that was exactly what she wanted it to be. Their son was born on a hot August morning in 1879. He arrived in the proper manner of babies who are not interested in being convenient, at 4 in the morning with a thunderstorm moving in from the west, and the labor was long but uncomplicated, attended by Dr. Aldrich, who was present and practical and competent throughout. Gilbert was in the hallway for most of it, because Dr. Aldrich was firm about what she called a clean working space, and he spent those hours with his hands wrapped around a cold coffee cup, doing the specific mathematics of a man who loves someone and is not in control of their situation. When Dr. Aldrich opened the bedroom door and said, with professional satisfaction, "You have a boy, Mr. Covington, and they are both perfectly well," Gilbert's exhale was the longest and most thorough breath he had taken in 6 hours. The boy was named James Robert Covington, the James for Celia's father and the Robert for Gilbert's, which she had proposed and he had accepted immediately. He was red-faced and objectionable-looking in the way of all newborns and already, unmistakably, present, which was how Celia thought of it, not just existing but present, with a quality of determined attention about him that she chose to interpret as character. Decker, upon being informed, went away and came back with a second carved wooden horse, which had apparently been in preparation for some time. The months after James was born were the fullest and most complicated of Celia's life, full in the particular relentless way of a new baby and a functioning ranch, and a partnership that required constant active tending. She continued her work as foreman, shifting schedules and adapting as needed, with Gilbert stepping in ways that were specific and practical and respectful, which she noticed and appreciated. He was not someone who swooped in to rescue. He was someone who asked what was needed and then did it. They were tired in those months. They were tired in the bone-deep way of people with a great deal to care for, and the tiredness was real and they did not pretend otherwise. But there was a particular sweetness under it that neither of them could have produced independently, the sweetness of a shared life that contained things worth being tired for. James grew quickly, as babies do, and showed early signs of the combined practical curiosity of both his parents, which delighted Celia in ways she had not anticipated. She had not thought much about motherhood before it arrived. She had been too occupied with the work of living to project very far into that particular future, but she found, to her genuine surprise, that she was good at it in the specific way. She was good at most things she cared about, not by following rules but by paying attention. She paid attention to James the way she paid attention to a herd or a fence line or a day's weather, with an active, interested, loving observation that was entirely her own. By the fall of 1880, James was 13 months old and pulling himself up on the furniture with a determined persistence that Celia recognized as deeply familiar. The ranch was operating at what Celia privately considered its optimal capacity, not its maximum capacity, because she had specific plans for expansion that she was developing carefully, but its best current version. The August drive that year had gone even better than the first, with a larger herd and a better negotiated price, and the accounts were comfortably in the black. Decker, who had turned a year older and whose silver beard had gone more white than silver, had taken Eli under a specific informal mentorship that nobody had planned and nobody commented on directly, but which had produced, over the course of a year and a half, a genuinely skilled young cowhand out of what had been a capable but uncertain boy. Eli no longer looked anxious. He looked purposeful, which was an entirely different thing and a better one. Pete had become, through the long, steady application of Celia's expectations, a measurably more careful worker. He still had his moments, but his moments had become significantly less consequential, and there was a particular afternoon when he caught an error in his own supply count before anyone else did and corrected it without being asked, which Celia noted as a turning point. Ruiz's wife had a baby of her own in the spring, a daughter, and there was a general festivity in the bunkhouse about this that lasted the better part of a week. Ruiz brought his wife and daughter to the ranch for Sunday supper, and Celia and Luz Ruiz sat on the porch with their respective children in the warm spring evening, and talked about the specific pleasures and indignities of early motherhood with a candor that was only possible between people who were currently in the middle of it. It was Luz who said, with a bright practicality, "You know what this ranch needs? Another child." Celia looked at her with an expression that was partly amusement and partly the particular internal acknowledgement of something she had been thinking about for some time. "I am not opposed to the idea," she said. "Does your husband know you are not opposed to it?" "He has expressed a similar lack of opposition." Luz smiled. "Good," she said. "Ranches run better with families in them." Their second child arrived in the winter of 1881, a girl this time, whom they named Clara, for no reason other than that it was the name that felt right when they looked at her, dark-haired and determined-looking even at 3 days old. James, at 2 years old, was interested in Clara in the specific mixed way of a toddler confronting a new sibling, alternating between fascinated attention and lordly indifference, which Celia observed with quiet amusement. Gilbert held Clara on the morning of her second day, sitting in the chair by the bedroom window in the winter light, and Celia watched him from the bed and felt the specific completeness of that image. The man, the child, the winter light, this house that was hers as much as anyone's on earth, and thought about the morning in April 3 years before when she had ridden into Harlan Creek with a worn saddlebag, and nothing but her own capability for company. She had not known then that this was what was waiting for her. She had not been looking for it. She had been looking for work and for purpose and for the feeling of belonging to a place, and she had found all of that and more, and the more had exceeded every expectation she had been careful not to have. "What are you thinking?" Gilbert said without looking up from Clara. "The same thing as always," she said. He looked up at that with a soft, curious expression. "That I am exactly where I should be," she said. He held her gaze for a long, warm moment across the winter room. "So am I," he said. For the first time in a very long time. Clara slept in his arms, and James was asleep down the hall, and outside the window the Texas winter was stark and brilliant and enormous, and the ranch sat in it the way it had always sat in it, solid and real and full of work and purpose and life, and it was theirs. The years that followed built upon each other the way good years do, not explosively but steadily, layer upon layer of work and growth and small triumphs and occasional setbacks managed well. Celia's expansion plans, developed carefully through the winter of 1880 and presented to Gilbert in the spring of 1881 with the same organized clarity she brought to every presentation she had ever made across the kitchen table, were implemented in phases over the next 2 years. They added a small horse breeding operation to the cattle enterprise, leveraging what Celia had observed about Sully's particular gift with horses into a modest but consistently profitable sideline. They purchased the adjacent parcel to the north when its previous owner retired and moved east, which expanded the range considerably and allowed the cattle operation to scale in ways that the original property had not permitted. The accounts were healthy. The crew was solid. The ranch, which had been a struggling, disorganized, grief-shadowed operation when Celia rode in on a spring morning and knocked on the front door, had become a genuinely thriving enterprise, well regarded in the county and known specifically for the quality of its cattle and the extraordinary competence of its management. Celia Covington, as she was now, had a reputation in Harlan Creek and in the broader county that she had not planned and would not have sought but accepted because it was accurate. She was known as the best ranch manager in the district, which was what she had always been. The fact that this was broadly acknowledged rather than reluctantly tolerated was a difference that had taken several years to become stable, and she was aware of the injustice in that her competence had required years of proof to achieve acknowledgement that would have been granted in months to a man of equivalent skill. She acknowledged this without bitterness, because bitterness was expensive, but she did not pretend the inequality had not been there, and did not stop noticing when it appeared in different forms. She spoke about it once directly to Dr. Aldrich, over tea in town on a winter afternoon when the children were with Gilbert, and she had come in for supplies and stopped because she wanted the company of another practical woman. "They gave you credit eventually," Dr. Aldrich observed. She was a thin woman with sharp blue eyes and a dry, economical wit. "They did," Celia agreed, "and I am grateful for that. But my father gave me everything he knew and built me to run an operation, and the first thing I was required to do when I tried to use that knowledge professionally was prove, over and over, that the knowledge was actually there. My male colleagues were assumed to have knowledge until they proved otherwise. I was assumed to lack it until I proved otherwise. The direction of that assumption matters." Dr. Aldrich nodded with the recognition of someone who knew exactly what she meant from her own experience. "And what do you do about it?" she asked. "I do the work," Celia said, "exactly as I always have, and I make sure that the women who come after me have slightly less proving to do." She meant this in a specific sense. There was a girl in Harlan Creek named Sarah, 16 years old, daughter of one of the other small ranchers in the area, who had come to Celia the previous summer and asked if she could come out to the ranch and learn. Not as a hand, she was not old enough for that, but to watch and to understand how an operation of this scale was managed. Celia had said yes immediately, and Sarah had spent 3 weeks at the ranch that summer observing everything, asking questions that were startlingly good, and leaving at the end of it with a notebook full of observations and the beginning of a real education in ranch management. Celia expected to see her again. She expected that when Sarah was old enough to manage or to take over her own family's operation, she would do it competently, and some portion of that competence would trace back to 3 weeks on the Covington Ranch under the eye of someone who had chosen to share what she knew rather than protect it. Her father had done that for her. It seemed right to do it for someone else. James turned 4 in August of 1882 and announced at breakfast that he was going to be a rancher when he grew up, which pleased both his parents deeply and for slightly different reasons. Clara turned 1 and demonstrated early signs of what her father called stubbornness and her mother called clarity of preference, which were the same quality from different angles. That fall, Gilbert took James out with him for the first time to watch the cattle being worked, sitting in the saddle in front of his father on a steady old horse named Biscuit, and the look on James's face for the entirety of that afternoon was the expression of a person who has encountered their purpose for the first time and recognized it. Celia watched them come back across the yard at dusk, Gilbert with James in front of him on the horse and both of them talking with animated attention about what they had seen, and she felt the specific happiness that is only possible when the specific things you love are all in the same place at the same time. Decker, who was passing through the yard at that moment, stopped and looked at the same sight and made a sound that was, for Decker, approximately equivalent to a standing ovation. On a Sunday evening in October of 1882, the whole crew gathered at the ranch house for supper, which had become a monthly custom over the past 2 years, and which Celia had established because she believed that people who worked together should occasionally eat together, and because the cooking on those evenings was considerably better than what the bunkhouse produced on its own. Ruiz brought his wife and daughter. Eli brought a letter from his mother saying she was well, and that she had met a very nice widower at her church in Abilene, which information was received with enthusiastic approval from the entire table. Pete did not spill anything, which everyone noticed and nobody said. After supper, with Clara asleep on Celia's shoulder and James sitting on the floor with Decker's 2 carved horses conducting some elaborate imaginative battle, and the voices of the people around the table rising and falling in easy conversation, Celia looked across the room at Gilbert where he sat talking with Ruiz and felt, with a fullness that had no edges, the complete and settled rightness of the life she was living. He caught her looking and returned it, across the warm room full of their family and their people, and what was in his eyes was exactly what was in hers: love and recognition, and the specific happiness of a man who knows he is exactly where he belongs. Later, when the crew had gone back to the bunkhouse and the children were asleep, and the house was quiet in the deep country way that has no equivalent sound anywhere else on earth, they sat together on the porch in the cool fall night, and Gilbert took her hand and they looked out at the land that was theirs, at the pastures they had built together, and the fences they had built together, and the future that spread out ahead of them as wide and full of possibility as the Texas sky above. "I have been thinking," Gilbert said. "About what?" "About the fact that you rode into town 3.5 years ago in answer to a notice I had nearly given up on, and changed every single thing." "You changed things too," she said. "Not without you," he said. "None of the important things." She leaned her head against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. The fall night was clear and enormous and full of stars, and the ranch made its familiar evening sounds around them, and inside the house their children slept safely in the place they had built. "Do you ever think about where you would have gone," he said, "if you had not stopped in Harlan Creek?" She considered this honestly, the way she always considered questions he asked her. "No," she said. "I stopped thinking about that very early on. There was too much to do here." He laughed, soft and warm in the night air. "There still is," he said. "Good," she said. "That is exactly how I like it." And it was exactly how she liked it. This ranch, this man, these children, this hard and beautiful and endlessly demanding life built out of work and honesty, and the specific kind of love that is not separate from the dailiness of things but woven all through it. The morning coffee and the evening conversations, the fence lines walked and the drives planned, and the arguments across the kitchen table that arrived at something better than either position alone. The hand taken across the space between horses and the forehead kissed in the lamplight of the bunkhouse, and the name said quietly in a kitchen at 3 in the morning like something worth holding carefully. She had come to Harlan Creek with a worn saddlebag and a reputation, and 7 years of knowledge earned honestly. She had taken the job that 4 men had left and had it running in a week, and in doing so she had found the permanence she had not known she was looking for, the belonging she had not let herself want. It had not been simple. It had required the same thing everything in her life had required, showing up and doing the work, and refusing to be diminished by people who needed her to be smaller in order to feel comfortable. It had required honesty about what she wanted when the wanting was complicated, and the wanting was something she had not planned for, and the wanting was, in the end, worth every piece of courage it cost. The stars above Harlan Creek were the same stars that had been above San Antonio when she was a child riding out with her father in the morning dark. The same stars that had been above every ranch and drive and difficult situation she had navigated alone. They were above her now, and she was not alone, and the difference between those two versions of the same sky was everything she had built, and everyone she loved, and the specific, ordinary, extraordinary life that spread out from this porch in every direction she cared to look. She kept Gilbert's hand in hers, and the night moved slowly around them, and the ranch was quiet and sound, and Celia Conley Covington was exactly where she should be. Exactly where she had always been going, though she had not known it until she arrived.